I think it was really critical thinking that got people like myself and Ann Wilson, who was from Wilfrid Laurier and also a social scientist, on the panel. And I think that I was pleasantly surprised by the response of the people who were on the panel. They took these regional concerns seriously. I'll just say that the very first day of the panel, the first group to show up was the U15. And the U15 used to be the U5, and they, I think, grudgingly expanded their boundaries and permitted 10 more universities to join them. And they were relentless. They actually had 3 employees come in, their executive director, their president, and somebody who was carrying their papers. And they had a PowerPoint presentation, they had handouts, and their messaging was basically, after we're done our meeting, there'll be no need for further questioning of colleagues across the nation, because clearly money needs to be funneled towards the U15. It's great that there are these feeder institutions, and that was exactly the language that was used, that provide us with trained personnel, but real research happens in Toronto and Montreal. And so, with that being the sort of gauntlet that was laid down, I felt that it was really important for me and as a representative of the West to step up and say, actually, there's some stuff happening here too. Kirsty Duncan, the Minister of Science, was commissioned to set a panel together to review the funding ecostructure in Canada. It has not been done for over 40 years. The last review was done 41 years ago. So you can imagine things have changed a little bit in the way that research is done and the way funding is done. There were some pretty heavy hitters in the room. David Naylor is the former president of the U of T. The Order of Canada recipients on here are David Naylor, Bob Bergeneau, Martha Crago, Mike Lazaridis, and Martha Piper. And then Remy Quirion's got one too. And then Art McDonald had just been given a Nobel Prize. So I show up and I've got my You Left pin, right? Everybody's got all this bling on their lapels. But they were a really congenial group. And I learned a tremendous amount from them about how to be inclusive. And Art McDonald, who is a physicist, was lovely, and he was really receptive to the things that I had to say, and was very surprised by what social science might have to contribute to the conversation about knowledge production. I found him to be genuinely lovely. So why should we be supporting research, and really who cares? And I hear this not only from people in the community, but sometimes from researchers or from university personnel themselves. It's a lot of times sort of presented as a side project. But research can do a lot for us, and this is a list that was generated out of the kinds of feedback that we received from people in the community. We need to be consistently reminding ourselves, the public, and politicians and political bodies that supporting fundamental research is something that improves the lives of all of our citizens in multiple ways. It has about fostering inclusion, informing policy, creating innovative technology, improving health, all of these things. It might seem self-evident, but in the last 15 years, as I hope to show in the talk, it's been clear that research has been starved in this country. Government does not seem to always see research as valuable. Funding has been decreased regularly. We have also seen a shift in the way that funding is allocated, with an increasing emphasis on innovation and commercialization in research, and an increasing starvation of basic bench research. So there's a concern there that this focus on innovation and technology operates in many ways to the detriment of basic inquiry. And sometimes we can't tell whether or not basic inquiry is going to lead to something that is going to improve the world, or improve our health, or improve our society, or improve our inclusion or our policies. Sometimes research is just not commercializable. That doesn't mean it's without value. So the more we engaged in the research of actually doing the panel, the more it became clear to us that this focus on innovation was problematic and undermining to the overall research landscape in Canada. The research value is not only something that we can see at a macro scale, but there's also local and regional reasons to support research as well. Research money that comes into this university pays the salaries of numerous graduate students. I'm looking at a few of them in this room here who've been supported by SSHRC or NSERC grants. It produces jobs for research coordinators. It produces jobs to supply labs and all of those things for local economies. There's plenty that happens to the local Lethbridge economy that is supported by the fact that people write grant proposals. And we need to be able to make connections to those things for others. It also is important, contra U15, that research be located in regional centers as well and be fed as well as in those centers, because some of the problems that we experience locally are different. And some of the information that we generate locally can inform those global packages of knowledge in ways that are really critical to producing something that is of value to all of us. So we were given two main questions. Here they are. You know, are there overall program gaps? Are there elements of programming that other countries could give to us as a roadmap? We hadn't had a review. We hadn't really seen any kind of analysis of where we were going. So these are the two questions that kind of guided us in our inquiry. We started out with a secretariat that was, that was given to us like on loan from somebody, but eventually it looked like the problem was just getting bigger and bigger, and it mandated having a dedicated staff. We set up a website and we received almost 13 online submissions. Those submissions, some of them were from individuals and some of them were from organizations. We also had presentations across the country. We had face-to-face from Halifax to Victoria and many places in between. I'm trying not to go and save the baby. Save the baby. We had a really big outpouring of people, and a lot of the face-to-face meetings were actually really passionate. People showed up, they were angry, they were emotional, they were frustrated, they were clearly advocating for research and for their work, and clearly informed about what it was that they were looking for. We decided to focus primarily on university research. There was a simultaneous review going on science and innovation through another ministry. And there is also a whole field of research, like the research center that out on the east side, that we didn't focus on. Those are federal employees working in federal agencies, and that didn't seem to be our mandate. We're not the only people who care about this sort of thing. Universities Canada has conducted a survey since we put the report out, and they interviewed and surveyed 1,500 Canadians on a representative sample, and I can talk about methodology with you. But basically, these questions were answered, and they're representative of Canadian attitudes. So the first one I'll point out is the second line down, where people are clearly indicating that they see the value of research. So don't despair, fellow university scholars, because people actually think what happens in universities matters. They see it as practical. They see it as up to date, what's happening in Canadian universities, and then we start to see a little bit of a shift downward, and particularly on the scale between whether we're world class, whatever that means, or not world class, there's a shift. And then down to the bottom, I mean, yay raw that Jane Q. Public thinks this way, we're not adequately funded. And stunningly, she's right. So I think it's good that the public is behind this. I think it's good that we can take that messaging to politicians on that score as well. This question I decided to highlight separately. This is really the importance of research work as far as Canadians' perceptions are concerned in terms of Canada's future. And here we have an overwhelming majority of Canadian people who really think that research is not just a nice thing to do, but that it is vitally important for the future of our country if we want to have a country in which Canadians wish to live. So I'll give you a little bit of language to help you understand some of the challenges that we're facing in the research ecosystem. So GERD. GERD is the money that the government actually provides to universities in order to accomplish research. GERD comes from primarily the Tri-Council. Many of you will be familiar with these three, SSHRC, CIHR, and NSERC. Some of it comes from the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, which provides people with lab equipment and heavy machinery and all of those kinds of infrastructure things. GERD is the only source of funding that consistently, almost, carries with it money that covers the indirect cost of research. Researchers hate the indirect cost of research clause, right? It's like, that 20% should be mine. But there's just a little list that I'll give you of what that 20% covers. So it covers things like establishing payroll systems for your grad students. It covers things like turning on lights and provisioning lab space, providing chemicals, offering financial services so that you can pay your bills or get your money back on your travel, advice and training for grant application success. The research grant facilitators' salaries are paid out of this. Infrastructure to support research assistants, support for ethical protocols so your work doesn't run awry and you don't go to jail because you've done something really bad. All of these things are covered by research infrastructure costs, the costs that are given at source. I say it's almost covered by the federal government. CIHR, which is one of the most heavily funded of the three councils, does not actually cover research costs at source. The national average sits at about 20% for GERD. The other way that research gets funded in universities is BIRD. I don't make them up. And BIRD is money that comes from business. And there are indeed people in our university who are doing research paid for by industry. Industry is great. We're happy to have partnerships with them. We're happy to help them to answer questions that are critical. But industry will not pay any research support fund. There's no indirect costs of research that are covered by BIRD. And then the final one that we have is HERD. Is HERD. Excuse me, I've just had a moment of not believing that word. This is the money that universities themselves carve out of their budgets in order to support research. So this includes things like studentships, stipends, course releases, internal grant money, space allocation, providing lab and research spaces, library resources, data storage, ethical regulation, like a billion things. This is how a lot of research gets supported through the universities themselves. So a telling example of how HERD is falling apart for us can be illuminated through the Canada Research Chair Program. So in 2001, the Canada Research Chair Program was started, and a Tier 2, which would be a relatively new researcher, a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair is funded to the tune of $100,000. In 2001, that $100,000 would probably have paid for $50,000 to $55,000 worth of salary and $50,000 a year. So this is $100,000 a year, and $50,000 a year would have been left for research. You could hire a grad student, you could bring a postdoc in, you could, have a great colloquium series going, you could do a billion things with that $50K. There has never been an increase to the Canada Research Chair Program since its inception 16 years ago. So today, we hire a CRC at $100,000, and they start probably at about $80,000 or $85,000 in salary, and their deductions at source bring that up to $100,000, and there ain't no gravy left, right? So where does it come from? Where does this money come from that supports these young scholars to do their excellent work? It comes from your colleague being retired and not replaced. It comes from your class sizes being larger and larger every year. It comes from your service requirements being ever increased. So when we say we're tired and we say we're fed up, we're right. We're not fed enough. Oh yeah. So, universities are increasingly hollowing out their operating funds in order to support research. The question then becomes, how well is that strategy working in sustaining our performance nationally and internationally? So there's three key elements, and this is a really contentious kind of an argument for scholars, right? You know, how do we measure what impact is? What is good research? And in a lot of fields, this is a problematic term because it's difficult. You're not producing a widget. You're not patenting something. You're not actually, you know, you're saying you couldn't find me on what index was it that you? I'm on Google Scholar. And so PubMed, yeah, you know, so I have an H index. I think it's 18. This is an embarrassing thing for me to say in a room full of scientists who would expect an H index to be 40 or 50 or whatever. In my world, the fact that I've managed to obtain $700,000 worth of research funding over the last 15 years is like a piece of light should come shining in through the window right now and transport me into heaven, because it's pretty astonishing, right? But in the world of neuroscience, that's nothing. That wouldn't turn on your lights for more than 2.6 years, according to your estimates earlier, right? So impact is hard to really compare across these silos. It's very difficult to know who's doing what. That said, we decided that we would just go for it, and we have used a few measures that include publications, include things like numbers of grants given, include impact factors, include being invited to talks, all of these kinds of things. The key outcome of this analysis, and I'll show you a more detailed chart in a minute, is that our country is not performing as it was. We have dropped out of the top 30 on this wide range of measures, and we're finding that the ratio of where the funding comes from for Canadian researchers is declining in terms of government money, and is increasing in terms of the proportion of education money that is going to support research. It's not healthy. So, I'm going to just go straight to this one. This is an indication of how we're looking in terms of our performance compared. We decided not to go with G7 because really, like, there's no way to compare. Just like we can't compare sociologists or historians to physicists or neuroscientists, we can't really compare Canada very well to Britain and to the United States. So we chose a few key countries: Canada, Australia, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, Israel, Taiwan, and Singapore, mainly because of their population size and the ratio of the number of institutions that they have, and based on a similar sort of funding scenarios. What we're seeing across all of these is that Canada, this is, I think it's 2013 data, yeah, that Canada is not doing well. It's interesting, this last one on the right-hand side is the innovation one, and I think this is why we hear the innovation language so much, because Canada does really lag behind in its comparator countries in terms of commercialization. But we're also, not in the top on all of these other, I think the one on the right-hand side is kind of interesting too. We have this sort of moral panic that there's too many PhDs being produced, but compared to countries who are working in similar kinds of rates and with similar kinds of funding scenarios and with a similar sort of landscape of university education, Canada is not anywhere near the top. We're not overproducing in that sense. We're also not overproducing in terms of the number of highly cited publications, the just plain number of sub-publications, the top 10 papers, these kinds of metrics that we see and hate, but then have to use in a graph because we need to explain why it is that what we feel is actually made manifest here. And I will say, I'm not going to, the report is 280 pages long in case anybody wants to do a little light reading on the weekend, and there's plenty of tables in here that can help to unpack the trends over the 15-year period. I'm just kind of giving you some high points. But the story about the last 15 years is that we've seen ourselves fall back on all of these measures. So the first recommendation, funnily enough, was not that we should throw some money at the research system, but was more that we should get some governance of it because it's an ungodly mess. So it's not sexy to say we need another organizing and oversight board. It's not sexy to see we need more administration. But in all of the roundtables that we held and in all of the feedback that we received from people, what we heard again and again is that there are really huge gaps in the system. It's not just that it's underfed, it's uncoordinated, it operates sometimes at odds to one another. So here's a graphic that will give you a sense of what some of the funding pressures look like. The research community has been raising concerns about lack of resources for quite a long time. But it's not just that money is missing. We heard from researchers that the balance of funding, particularly between investigator-led research and research that is determined at the government level, means that a lot of research that they're doing is either unsatisfying or it's removing the balance of their ability to do strong work. An increasing proportion of funding has been allocated to priority-driven work. And this gives you a sense, this graphic on this side over here on your left gives you a sense of how this has happened. It's not just hard dollars that have changed, but the ratio of whether or not this is investigator-led, curiosity-driven research or priority-driven government-mandated research. In 2001, investigator-led research, this is the dark blue line, represented 70% of research costs, research dollars allocated. In 2001, 30% of that sat at priority-driven calls for investigation. And the problem with priority-driven calls for investigation is very often these are kind of, in response to something that's happening in the community, in response to some uproar politically in the community that is letting the government make a decision that they need to do something. So we've seen, for example, a huge upswell in Indigenous research and calls for an Indigenous scholarship over the last 5 years, some of it in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I have no problem with that at all, except that we don't actually have capacity for that. We don't actually have trained researchers to the extent that these calls are asking, who are experts in Indigenous knowledge and in Indigenous ways of knowing. So in some ways, we're asking people to respond to initiatives that we're not equipped to actually answer. And this is something that we wanted in the panel to see redressed. So by the time we got to 2015, 2016, you can see that these two lines have almost come to meet each other. That we've got 55% of the research is actually investigator-led as opposed to 70, and 45% of the research is policy-driven rather than necessarily in response to the capacity that we have, the expertise we have, or the problems that are really on the ground. I'm almost done. This is a discussion just to illustrate for you some of the problems with the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, which is the infrastructure fund that helps to feed health and science research in the country. And this graph basically just outlines how that money has looked in terms of its distribution over the last 15 years. And you can see that, in fact, there's no predictability to it. You can see visually how difficult it is for researchers to actually imagine how to pitch their request for equipment, how to imagine building their research, not just a project, but their research careers, without knowing whether or not there's going to be money coming towards them. Facilities and operations. I'm coming down to the wire on this. This is the infamous Research Support Fund, those monies that come from the government to cover the costs of keeping the lights on and the projects alive. CFI looks after equipment for most of the researchers who are in the science and health fields. The infrastructure costs, the Research Support Fund, in theory, supports all researchers to continue to do their work. It gives them an office to sit in, it gives them studentships to draw on, it gives them all kinds of support in order to do this. The institutional average for this money in Canada sits right now at 21.6%, which when we did an international comparison was very, very low. In the United States, the reimbursement rate for the cost of doing research, and I'm just going to say this number and I want you to take it into account, the cost of doing research is set at 60%. When we look at how much money people get in the United States to support their research that doesn't go into their grants, they get 60%. This is really a huge difference. This is 300% what we get in order to do our jobs, right? So when you don't get a colleague that replaces your buddy, or when you call our office and we can't give you service, or when you talk to your dean and you ask for a course release because you're losing your mind, think of that 60% and feel sad, but don't move to the States. Please, God, don't move to the States. We need you all here. So this is one of the hugest recommendations that is attached to the review. We've asked for an increase. We were so modest in our ask, so we've asked for an increase over time to go to 40%. So we've asked a 5-year stepwise increase to bring it to 40%. And now Rachel, where's Rachel? Are you circulating these letters? Yes. So we have. I brought petitions. Former petitioner and activist, I suppose. This is a letter that will go to Minister of Finance Morneau, and will also go to Kirsty Duncan and to several other active ministers who've been looking at this problem. The report was actually released after the budget this spring. We finished up our report in December, and we're hoping to be able to release it to government in time for the 2017 spring budget. And there was a decision made to hold back on that because there had to be a lot of schmoozing and lobbying and hand-holding to try and see that we could get enough politicians at the federal level on board so that we could, in fact, see some traction on some of the recommendations. So, as I say, Universities Canada has been doing this, CREW, which is a body we're a part of, the CAUT, all kinds of organizations, both institutional and para-institutional, have been writing letters, have been lobbying. There's been caucus meetings that have had members of the panel come and visit and give a pitch for what needs to happen. We need to be pushing, if for nothing else. If the only money we ask for is that we get the research support fund lifted, this would change, I think, all of our lives significantly, right? So I think that asking for 40%, taking this phased approach, we're asking for an influx of $96 million to the research support fund in year one. And by the end of it, almost a half $500 million to go into the research support fund to be distributed nationally. When we look at all of the changes that are being asked for in the review, it amounts to $1.3 billion. So right now the budget for research funding sits at $3.5 billion, and by the end of the 4-year period of phase-in, we're hoping for a budget of $4.8 billion. This sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But it really comes up to 0.4% of the Canadian government's annual budget. 0.4%. It's not a lot of money, considering what it is that universities contribute to their communities and to their societies, what this kind of knowledge has the potential to do in terms of transformation. With this kind of investment, Canada can expect a number of positive results. We can expect to have streamlined programming, higher success rates, lifting the morale of a next generation of researchers, and I do believe that we are demoralized as scholars in the country. We heard it. People wept. You know, they were quite emotional, I will say. Some of the meetings that we had, you know, and when you haven't lived till you've seen a physicist cry. So Canada can expect to see a lot of good things happening. We will see augmented productivity of our colleagues. We will see increased collaboration. We'll see streamlining and closing of gaps. And we'll see us taking back our place as research leaders internationally. Canada has had a very strong reputation as a knowledge-producing nation, and we're losing that capacity. We will also see schools and universities reducing their pressure on tuition, reducing their pressure on everyday operating costs, reducing their pressure on teaching aspects of the faculty position that you sort of outlined. We'll see a redress of the balance. So I just want to encourage you to sign the letter. To understand that this wasn't just a dry process. I mean, even talking about crying physicists, I feel a bit verklempt. And I think it's important that we understand that that research is not something that is divorced from the academic project. It is at its heart and center. And if we feed research properly, the rest of it, the service and the teaching, will have its breathing room and will be able to do the thing that we love to do most. Thank you.